Hi, my name is Rachel Kramer Bussell. I'm the editor in chief of Residence 11. You can find us at residence11.com. And we're a website and community that celebrates sensuality, romance, intimacy, and loving in a new age of human connection. This is part of our monthly author series where we'll be interviewing authors and highlighting their work. Over the next 15 or 20 minutes, possibly longer, we're going to be talking to Katrina Jackson, whose latest romance novel is Sabbatical. Katrina Jackson has a PhD in African American and African diaspora history. She's a professor by day who writes erotica, erotic romance, women's fiction, and historical fiction in her spare time. She writes racially diverse queer stories that show love and the world in all its beauty and colors. You can find out more at katrinajacksonauthor.com and follow her on Instagram at katjacksonbooks and on TikTok at author Katrina Jackson. And make sure you hit subscribe wherever you're watching this so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming interviews. Okay, so before I get to your writing career, I want to know about your interest in reading romance. What was the first romance novel or novels that you read, and how did you get into it?
I know it's a debate on whether or not this is romance, but as a middle schooler, early teenager, I loved Omar Tyree and Eric Jerome Dickey. I had an older cousin who was a really big reader, and I essentially just read whatever was on her bookshelves. And that's what she was reading. So it's like a blend of romance and urban fiction. And I loved, especially in my early teen years, I loved thinking that, oh, in my 20s, this is what life will be like. So
I had that with Danielle Steele and Judith Krantz.
yeah, life was much more boring, but with a
So,
fantasy.
at what point did you go from being a romance reader to wanting to write romance and starting out on your own with writing? And I actually don't know the answer to this. What was your first romance novel that you wrote?
Um, it was oh, so the first romance novel I wrote was called Up in the Air, but I never published it. And the first one I published was called Encore, which I pulled down a few years ago to revise and expand a little bit. Um, but I started writing romance in graduate school because I was really sick of writing history and I needed an escape and I wanted to go back to creative writing. So I just sort of took a shot at writing mostly fan fiction at first and then like romance novels, my own ideas and characters.
And what was that process like? And can you tell us a little bit more about that novel that you wrote but didn't publish? Like, how come? And then how did you decide on the first one you did publish to go ahead and publish that one?
I think the process of moving from reading romance and amongst a few other things, like a lot of erotica as well, to writing it was mostly that I just needed the creative outlet that academic writing didn't give me. And so I just sort of took a shot at it, and I then wrote a lot of like slice of life things, like not a lot of plot, just sort of like a glimpse into people's lives, which I still love, is still a part of a lot of my writing period. And it was learning how to craft a story um, from the ground up was like really challenging at the time, but a release from the other kinds of work that I was doing. So, and it was also nice to fail in that space. In a way, it's difficult to fail in academia because it was I was publishing online, and the I think the best thing about like fan fiction readers and Black women readers who are interested in that kind of work is that they're endlessly supportive and they give lots of like unsolicited like advice and encouragement. So I felt like that was a safe space to fail and like sort of find my voice. Um, and then the first novel that I wrote, but never published, mostly I never published it because I didn't know, like I wasn't an idea at the time. I just wanted to write. I wasn't even thinking about publishing. Um, but I've never gone back to that novel as something to publish because I realized in hindsight, one, it's a little too personal. Like it's very much me writing about a lot of the emotional turmoil of my life at that time. Um, And then also, it's just not a story. Like learning about how to craft like character arcs and story arcs was not in the table or in the charts at that time. So um, it would have to be something totally different to write to publish that now.
And so if you want to share this, like where were you publishing this fan fiction and what was it fan fiction of, the first one that you were working on?
I was publishing one on Archives Our Own, like like everyone else, but I was also publishing on this website created by a few Black women fan fiction authors that was specifically for Black women authors called The Chamber. I think it has a different name now. And it was similar to Archives of Our Own in that you could publish a chapter at a time. And I was writing fan fiction about quite literally everything I was watching, like Cold Case, The Vampire Diaries, um, anything, truly anything.
So how did you then make the transition out of strictly fan fiction into your own characters and stories? And then this could be two questions, but it might be related. You self-publish your books, and I would like to know how you decided on that, and was that a decision, or did you always, not was it a decision, but did you always know you wanted to self-publish, or did you consider other avenues and then turn to that?
Yeah. Wait, what was the first part of it? How did I?
You go from writing the fan
Oh,
fiction, which it sounds like you were writing a lot of it,
yeah.
to writing your own characters and stories.
Um, I just had so I think a lot of that fan fiction came out of the idea of wanting to fix story arcs on TV that just did not go the way I thought they should. Like, I think most fan fiction authors are like, there's this huge, obvious opportunity that all of these TV writers aren't taking. And so I'm going to write fan fiction. And I was absolutely one of them. Um, and um, and so I think that evolved from not just wanting to fix what I saw as other people's flawed stories to wanting to create my own stories, because even just as a person, but certainly as like a historian and a professor, I think there is room to want to fix other people's problems, but there's also space to just create something new, which felt much more not comfortable, but that was the sort of training I had as a scholar, but also like as like a young activist, is sometimes you have to be able just to create the room from scratch as opposed to sort of like trying to push yourself into a space that is not built for you. Which I think is how some people end up self-publishing, but it was not for me. I don't even remember where or how, but I just discovered that you could like publish your own books on Amazon. And I did like a little bit of research, not enough. And so I just sort of tried. And my first cover was terrible. And the book needed so much work, which is why I pulled it down. But a lot of my self-publishing career has been just me. I did make a decision and did very little research, and then just I'm still learning on the go, right? Like every week, every month, I realize something new I need to learn, and I figure out how to do it, and I ask for help now, which is also nice.
Speaking of asking for help, and I'm going to go back to some of the things you've learned, but I know you're an active part of a pretty thriving community in various online spaces of other romance authors, many Black women authors, many authors of color. Can you talk about how you went from, I guess, I assume not really knowing anyone, or maybe you'd met people online in the fan fiction, to now being part of a community of people online and perhaps off, but and how that community has helped you in your self-publishing journey?
I mean, a lot of it started on Twitter. When Twitter is great, it's great, right? Or at least it used to be. I don't know what it's like right now. But a lot of it started on Twitter, where I was just sort of following people I was reading, and then participating in conversations, and then just sort of talking to people on the timeline, but also crucially off the timeline in places where you can be like vulnerable and like, ask questions and all of that stuff. And yeah, I learned so much. I think at least for me at the time was I would self-publish a book and that was all I was doing. It was not a business. I wasn't, like writing really as a career or anything. And those friendships are really good in helping me realize that it is a business, right? And you have to treat it as such, as much as you are able. Um, but also learning from them how they were, working was also helpful for me in sort of figuring out how I could do this myself.
And now, speaking of the writing and the substance of your books, many of your romances feature polyamorous relationships. Sometimes that's part of a series, sometimes it's perhaps not. Why is that important to you? And what are some of your favorite polyamorous romances that you've written?
I think that I think I'm not polyamorous, so it would be I think nice to say, oh, I'm polyamorous and I want to see representation. I'm not though. But I think what I ended up seeing in fiction I was reading, but also TV shows and movies that I was watching, is that there was so much anguish in forcing people to choose between two. Like I remember being, like a late teens, early 20s, and the love triangle was in every TV show I watched and every movie I saw, especially rom-coms. And I was like, oh, this feels very forced. And again, it was like wanting to fix that sort of story. But then also, I am bisexual. And at some point, I didn't like the way in which some of those stories felt uh, like they were missing that you didn't have to find necessarily everything you wanted in a single partner, right? And whether or not you're bisexual, whether or not you're polyamorous, right? Your partner doesn't have to be everything to and for you. Like you can have other meaningful relationships. And all of that kind of swirled in my head. And I just thought, yeah, I'm going to write a polyamorous romance. And I think at first, the first one I wrote was from scratch. And then I thought, yeah, that's it, one and done. But I just kept sort of coming back to polyamorous romances, mostly because I think that for me, at some point, what I'm trying to sort of work through is how this character, all of these characters, um, are finding something in these individual people that they're with and that they're in relationships with, unique things in each case. And that for it to be a fulfilling romance, it doesn't have to be, just two people together, that they can have other relationships, and not even just romantic relationships, right? Like a friendship group, a found family, a community, all of those relationships matter.
As you were talking, it reminded me of when people say, oh, back in the 80s in books or TV, like things could have been solved if you had a cell phone. Like the idea that, some of these plot lines are contrived in a sense around monogamy, and that not that everything would be immediately solved by non-monogamy, but some of that choice, I think, would be. And well, not really related, but related to the content of your books. Your books are racially diverse, and some are Black romances featuring Black protagonists falling in love, and some are interracial romances. Can you talk about why it's important to you to be writing diverse characters of various races? And then this is really a part two, but if you want to take this on within that, in the broader publishing industry regarding romance, in the time that you've been writing romance, how do you think diversity in romance has fared, and what do you think publishing can be doing to improve the breadth of diversity as well as opportunities for authors of color who are writing diverse stories?
Oh, that second question is heavy. I think that every story, for the most part, comes to me with the characters' sexuality and racial identities being really clear. And it would be impossible to change that for lots of different reasons, because like who they are is bound up in their racial identity as much as like any other part of the personality or their character or the story arc. And it's super important to me to be writing interracial romances and multicultural romances and Black romances, because on some level, I am writing the world as I see it and the world as I live it too. So, my friendships, my working relationships, my own romantic relationships have been diverse in a lot of the ways that I have written in terms of race. And so this feels normal to me. And so I'm writing worlds that feel normal to me. It would be contrived for me to only write interracial romances or only write interracial romances in some way. And even for me to only write certain Black romances, right? So there's not, or at least when I started, there weren't a whole bunch of queer Black romances, but writing queer Black romances, having queer Black relationships is very normal to me in terms of the way that I see the world and the
Can
way
you
that I live it.
clarify for listeners what you mean by Black romance in case they don't know what exactly that references?
That everyone in the relationship is Black. So there are lots of people in my life who are queer people in my life where their partners are Black, their children are Black, whether they are biological or adopted. Like I am used to Black families looking, very specific ways, but also Black families having like other people of color in it, or white people in it. Like I'm used to the world being broad, I guess, in some ways. So, they always say as a writer, you should write what you know. To some extent, I am doing that, or I'm certainly trying to do that for sure. Um, I think, um, I think in terms of publishing and diversity, um, maybe 3 years ago, I would have had a slightly different idea. Um, but I think that sort of watching publishing over the last few years, and then also stepping away for the last few months, um, uh, I think I think the thing that is really distressing, which is not unique to publishing, is the way in which diversity becomes code for assimilation. And I've said this before publicly until things change. I'll say it again. I think there is a particular way in which, like traditional publishing specifically, because I think the indie space can be much broader. Um, I think traditional publishing views diversity as tokenization, so having specific authors of color to write very specific things. And for a while, that looked like interracial romances with a white partner only. And then I think now maybe that's changing a little bit, but I do see a sort of hemming in of some of the possibilities for some authors, whether it's storylines, whether it's certain kinds of characters, whether it's settings for characters. I'm a historian. I would love to read more historical romance, but I personally can't because I'm not interested in reading about Regency era England or Europe in the 19th century. And I don't really care who puts people of color there when there is an entire world where people of color do not have to be one of just a few. And so there's this sort of perpetual shrinking of the possibilities, which I think sort of diversity conversations always engender, because at some level, it's not about the possibility for a story. It's obviously what can I sell to a readership that I think publishing still imagines is primarily white.
You mentioned just now being a history professor, and as I read in your bio, you have a PhD in African American and African diaspora history, and you've now written, I believe, 2 romances. I don't know if there's more, Office Hours and Sabbatical, that are set in academia. Can you talk about your decision to merge those 2 worlds? Because I know that those 2 are coming out later in your career versus like the earlier books. And what kinds of reactions have you had to those novels, especially from other people in academia?
I do have other academics from scratch, which I pulled down also last year to revise, is a woman who left academia after not getting tenure. Um, I think this is another case of writing what you know. I have spent so much of my life in a university setting. It is where I go most days. It is, how I pay my bills. Um, and I couldn't not write about that, I think. But I also think, well, no, I know that I specifically wrote Office Hours because I had seen a sort of run of academic romances that were either entirely white and or they were student teacher romances, and none of those things jived with me. The entirely white space, I mean, I think there is something to be said for imagining academia as if it is 1950 that I think is problematic. But I also think academia is one of those spaces that's rich with hierarchy and rich with abuse, but also rich with possibility. And so I was just sort of frustrated of seeing sometimes non-academics, but sometimes academic writers writing about academia without any of the sort of nuance that I know exists. And I also think in terms of ethics, personally, for me, a student-teacher romance is never going to work. It may work for other people, but for me, it won't for lots of reasons. And some of which are because of what I've seen literally happen in programs I've been involved in, or through acquaintances and colleagues. And I wanted to write academics, first of all, in relationships with one another, but also to write academics of color. And one of the responses I got from a colleague who I know in real life and who is in the same field as me, but is also a writer after our published office hours, was that she was a little bit triggered by some of the like minutia of office hours of like literally what our days look like. Because a big message of that book is that the main character, Deja, is not taking care of herself. And she said, oh, I recognized my own patterns of behavior there, and it wasn't great. But I've also seen academics say, oh, it's nice to actually see, and they've said to me, it's nice to see the job actually look the way that it does look for me in real life.
You have written erotica, erotic romance, women's fiction, and historical fiction. Among those, do you have a favorite? And how do you juggle which one you're going to write next, or where you're going to focus your writing time?
Erotica, hands down, my absolute favorite. Yeah, it's my absolute favorite. But regardless, I try and move around. So I will usually write like a few contemporaries or a few romantic suspense in a row, and then I'll get burnt out. And then it's time to write something else. And usually the transition book is actually to just write something short and erotic. So it's like my palate cleanser for everything else.
And if someone hasn't read your work before and wants to start, obviously this would somewhat depend on their interests, but is there one or two books that you would say, okay, this is like the best introduction to my work, or the one that you think would interest a new reader the most?
Yeah, right now I'm choosing either Office Hours or The Hitman.
Those seem very different.
Yep.
Can you give us a little bit more detail? We heard about Office Hours. I know The Hitman. I've enjoyed The Hitman, and I was telling you this before. I don't read mafia romance. Yours is the only ones that I've read, because I feel kind of, I guess, squeamish about it. Like, how am I identifying with these characters and enjoying their story, even though one of them, their job is literally a hitman, or another mafia job? Can you talk about how you got into writing these mafia romances, and maybe any thoughts on why you think they're so popular? Because that is it's a subgenre that is growing, I think, and has been popular for a little while. And yours, I know you have many that you've written.
So so The Hitman is basically about a woman who finds out on her wedding day that her husband is cheating on her, and so with her best friend, and so she punches him and curses her best friend out and takes their honeymoon to Italy, where she meets a hitman who was on vacation outside of Milan. And that was literally the entire idea I had. And I was like, I don't know where that's going to go, but let's see. So I wrote it, but I like mafia romances personally. I like even some dark romances. I'm really interested in true crime. I've done a lot of reading and like watching documentaries of like the mafia in the US and in Italy. And I just like didn't I always wanted to know more about it. but I had tried to read a few mafia romances, and they were just not for me personally, and for lots of different reasons. And a lot of my when I move into a new subgenre, usually the idea is, can I do this thing that I like to read or that I think would be hard to do? Like, can I just test myself? Can I try out something new? Um, and can I make it sound like me? I think that's the big thing is I wanted uh the series is called the Family series. I wanted this Italian mafia series to sound like Katrina Jackson wrote it. Um and I think I succeeded in that. And I have had people say, like I told you before, that I don't read any other mafia romances or I normally don't like it, but I like you and I like this series. And I think that was the buy-in from my like regular readers who had mostly read like contemporary erotic romances from me, or like my spy series, which is also romantic suspense, but more erotic than anything else. Um, and this is just sort of a version of that. It's like, can you find like my same voice, my same interests, but in a slightly different sort of setting? So it was mostly just a sort of challenge to myself.
And we've talked about you making that transition from reading to writing and then writing in these various subgenres and trying new things. Do you have advice for romance authors who are just starting out or people who are thinking about going into writing romance, and especially for authors of color, whether that's about the writing side, the business side, or anything else?
Um, oh yeah, I probably have so many things to say. I think the thing um, that is really hard to do, but I think will serve you well in the long run of your career is to write things that make you happy. And I get to say this from a place of privilege. I am a self-published author, and I do have a day job that subsidizes the expensive lifestyle that I am sometimes trying to live. So I am not worried about, sort of paying my bills with my writing. But writing is usually really fun for me. It is still a bit of that escapism for me because I am writing books that make me happy, um, that still are doing some version of that thing I wanted in the beginning, which was to tell a story I didn't think I was seeing enough of, or to tell a story the way I would. So some of that is about like finding and honing your voice. Um, which again, I think is much more important than being able to write the very specific thing that we can think publishers or readers want. Sometimes readers want your literal voice, right? The voice that they aren't getting elsewhere. And so nurturing that, I think, is really important. Um, and I think the other thing that I am learning is allowing yourself um, the comfort of being the reader you're writing for. I think, especially if you're writing worlds that are diverse, that are inclusive, that are ethical, um, that should be coming from you personally. And so it should sort of make you happy, but it should also fit with your particular like sort of standard of ethics, etc. So that when it hits, the readership, when you query or whatever you do with the book, you can stand behind it like 10 tones down.
And what is next for you, and where can people find you? I know we said your Instagram is Kat Jackson Books and TikTok author Katrina Jackson. And I know you're also on Patreon if you want to talk about that.
Oh, I'm not on Patreon
You're
anymore.
not on Patreon anymore.
It was too much. It was too much work. Which you also, I mean, the other thing I would have said to new authors is learning when it's time to like give yourself a break. And Patreon was personally for me too much work on top of the other things I'm doing. Next for me, honestly, I don't know. I'm writing a bunch of things right now. And I don't know what I'll publish next. I don't really know when that'll come. Because the sort of thing I've been trying to focus on over the past like 5 or so months is like just stepping back and giving myself time to like think, rest, found a new therapist. Like we're trying to live as a whole person as opposed to just a stream of content.
That makes sense. Well, I look forward to seeing what you write next. And Katrina has a large backlist.
Yeah.
For everyone who wants to start exploring it or continue exploring it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.